April 12, 1945. Camp Segerville, Texas. The hot wind carried the smell of fuel and dust over the barbed wire. German prisoners looked up. A plane was landing on the nearby runway. Nothing unusual, they thought, until the cockpit opened. Out stepped a woman, leather jacket, flying goggles, calm as a soldier. The camp went silent. A woman pilot? Impossible, one prisoner whispered. It must be a trick, but it wasn't. She was real. An American wasp. A woman flying military planes while Europe still burned. And for the German women behind the fence, everything they had been taught about power, gender and war began to fall apart. What they saw that day would change them forever. Stay with us till the end to hear the full story of how captured German women discovered freedom in the most unexpected way. Like the video, subscribe to support the channel, and let's step back into 1945, when one flight shattered a lifetime of beliefs. The sun over Texas burned white that April day in 1945. Greta Hoffmann stood near the camp fence, watching dust swirl around the guard towers. She had been here for 6 months, long enough to know the sound of every truck, the pattern of every guard's boots, even the smell of the midday wind that carried both diesel and dry grass. Camp Segerville was quiet, almost too quiet for a prison. The war in Europe was ending, but here the hours still moved like sand through glass. That morning, something strange happened. The usual drone of aircraft came from the south, but it sounded lighter, higher pitched than the bombers or cargo planes that sometimes passed overhead. Prisoners looked up. A silver twin-engine plane cut across the sky and dipped low. Dust rose as it landed on the nearby airstrip. From behind the barbed wire, Greta shaded her eyes and squinted. Then she saw it. The pilot stepping down wasn't a man. It was a woman in a leather jacket, goggles around her neck, hair tied back under a cap. Another woman followed, laughing, her boots leaving sharp prints in the dust. Greta's mind froze. In Germany, the very idea of women flying military planes was laughable, against every rule she had been taught. Women piloting? Never, her old teacher had said. Yet here, in the middle of Texas, 2 women had just landed a US Army aircraft like it was nothing at all. Around Greta, the other prisoners whispered. Some refused to believe their eyes. Actors, one man muttered, for the Americans' propaganda films. But the guards didn't laugh or pose for photos. They simply waved to the women and went back to work. It wasn't a performance. It was routine. Greta felt a strange mix of shame and wonder. Back home, she had once dreamed of flying gliders near Leipzig, but her father had said it was unfit for girls. "Your place is on the ground," he'd told her. Now she was standing on that ground, behind a fence, watching women do what she had been forbidden to imagine. Life in the camp was simple, almost peaceful compared to the front lines. The prisoners built furniture, grew vegetables, repaired tools. They were given decent food, 2 meals a day, bread, sometimes even meat. The US military ran the place with strict fairness. Guards followed rules. No beatings, no cruelty. For many Germans, this alone was confusing. Weren't these the barbarians they had been warned about? That confusion deepened each afternoon when the sound of engines rolled over the camp again. Sometimes 1 plane, sometimes 3. Always the same bright gleam of wings against the sun. And always at least 1 pilot with a smaller build and a lighter stride. One of the wasps, as the guards called them. The women Air Force service pilots. Greta began to listen carefully to the guards talk. Over 1,000 of them, one said one day near the fence. Flying everything from trainers to bombers. Ferry jobs mostly. Dangerous work, but they do it better than some men. 1,000. That number hung in Greta's thoughts all night. Back in Germany, women had been ordered to knit, nurse or bear children. Here, women risked their lives in cockpits. At night, lying in the wooden barrack bunk, Greta imagined what it must feel like to sit behind a control stick, to see the world from above, free of walls and orders. The sound of the planes still echoed in her ears like a heartbeat. "If they can fly," she whispered to herself, "what else have we been lied to about?" The next morning the same engines returned. Greta hurried to the fence, pretending to fetch water. Dust and wind stung her eyes, but she kept watching. This wasn't a dream or propaganda reel. It was real life. Women flying for an army that didn't fear their strength. The belief that had shaped her whole world cracked a little more with each landing. And deep inside, a dangerous thought began to grow. Maybe the war had already been lost long before the guns fell silent. Lost to a truth her country had refused to see. This was not propaganda. It was reality. Back in Germany, before the war swallowed everything, Greta had sat in a schoolroom filled with Nazi flags and slogans. The teachers spoke with hard voices about duty and order. Boys were told they would be soldiers. Girls were told they would be mothers. The world was divided neatly, like black and white chalk lines. Planes and machines were for men. Cooking, cleaning and nursing were for women. Greta remembered how one of her classmates had once said she wanted to fly one day. The teacher made her stand up and apologize in front of everyone. "A woman's hands belong on the cradle," he said, "not on the controls of a plane." Those words had followed Greta through the years. Even when the bombs started falling on Leipzig, even when she saw women drive trucks or load ammunition, she still believed flying was something sacred to men. Now, standing in a POW camp thousands of miles from home, that belief was falling apart piece by piece. Each morning, the prisoners lined up for roll call. They wore faded uniforms, patched and stiff from washing. Some men still carried themselves like soldiers. Others just looked tired. Beyond the barbed wire, the airfield shimmered in the Texas heat. Greta began to notice details. How the female pilots walked with the same confident stride as the men. How ground crews treated them as equals. No one seemed shocked to see them there. She overheard one guard talking proudly to another. "The Wasps have ferried over 12,000 aircraft already," he said. "Trainers, pursuit planes, even bombers. 38 lost their lives doing it." His voice softened at that last part, almost like a prayer. 12,000 planes, 38 dead. Greta did the math in her head, as if numbers could help her understand. These women weren't symbols. They were workers, fighters, pilots in every sense but name. One afternoon, as the prisoners unloaded crates near the fence, Greta saw a small yellow plane land. Its engine purred like a sewing machine. When the pilot stepped out, she smiled toward the tower, brushing dust from her sleeves. Greta felt her chest tighten. That smile didn't look proud or rebellious. It looked free. Inside the barracks that night, Greta tried to talk about it. "They fly because America has too many men to waste on deliveries," one prisoner said. "No," another argued. "They fly because they can. The Americans don't care about old rules." The argument grew loud, and the guard shouted for silence. But Greta lay awake long after lights out, her mind racing. She remembered propaganda posters back home, painted women with gentle smiles, waving goodbye to husbands who never returned. She wondered what those same women would think if they saw this camp, this airfield, these pilots. Days passed, and the airfield's rhythm became part of the camp's heartbeat. Engines starting at dawn, planes returning in the afternoon, the distant smell of fuel mixing with the scent of beans from the kitchen. Greta found herself timing her chores to the sound of takeoffs. The guards noticed but said nothing. Maybe they understood. In her thoughts, she began comparing two worlds, one that promised strength through control, and another that allowed strength through choice. The difference was terrifying and beautiful at once. Sometimes the planes flew so low that the ground vibrated under her shoes. Greta would close her eyes and pretend the vibration was coming from inside her, a quiet power waiting to rise. One day, a piece of paper blew against the fence, caught in the wire. She picked it up carefully. It was part of a maintenance checklist with smudged pencil notes and a faint perfume scent. She held it like a relic. The handwriting was neat, confident, unmistakably female. In that small moment, Greta understood that the old rules of the sky had already been rewritten. The world outside the fence was larger than she had ever been told, and each passing day, the sound of those engines made her believe that maybe she could belong in it too. But belief is a dangerous thing in a prisoner's camp, because once it takes hold, it demands action. What Greta did next would change her life forever. Every afternoon, the same thing happened. Around 2 o'clock, the steady hum of engines filled the air. Prisoners dropped their tools, squinting toward the airfield just beyond the fence. Greta was always one of them. Her hands, rough from garden work, gripped the wire as she counted the small silver dots in the sky. 1, 2, 3, The planes glided down in perfect formation, wheels kissing the runway. Dust rose, glowing like smoke in the sun. The guards didn't even look up anymore, but Greta never missed a landing. Each time, she searched for a flash of sunlight on a leather jacket, a pale braid under a flight cap, a sign that one of the pilots was a woman. The other prisoners teased her. "Still dreaming, Greta?" one of them said. "You'll get blisters from staring at that fence." But she didn't answer. She couldn't stop watching. The sight of those women moving so calmly, so sure of themselves, had become her only escape from the endless routine of camp life. She began to notice patterns. One of the pilots, a tall woman with auburn hair, always touched the wing of her plane before walking away, as if saying thank you. Another, smaller and darker-haired, carried a metal lunchbox with a painted blue star. Greta started calling her the Star Lady. At night, Greta wrote about them in her small notebook, a few pages torn from a supply ledger. She described their planes, their movements, their smiles. She didn't know why she wrote. Maybe she just wanted proof that what she saw was real. One evening, she heard the guards talking near the barracks. "Those wasps are something," one said. "Can you believe they logged over 60 million miles? Ferry flights, test flights, even towing targets for live gunnery. 60 million miles. Greta couldn't even imagine that distance. It was as if these women had circled the whole planet 100 times. The next morning, she saw the Star Lady again. The woman waved briefly toward the guards, then walked close to the fence to pick up a fallen rag. For a second, her eyes met Greta's. It wasn't a long look, but it felt like the fence between them melted away. After that, Greta's obsession grew. She began sneaking closer whenever she could, pretending to collect firewood or check tools. From there, she could hear the laughter of the pilots, the whir of engines cooling, the clatter of metal on concrete. The air smelled of oil, grass, and heat. Strange, comforting scents that made her forget she was a prisoner. Once, while washing clothes near the guard post, she overheard two Americans talking about a pilot named Nancy Corbett. "She ferried 3 AT-6 Texans in 1 week, one said proudly. "Got grounded for flying through a storm. She said the clouds were just too beautiful to avoid." The men laughed. Greta smiled without meaning to. There was something wild and brave in that name. Nancy. That night, Greta whispered to her bunkmate, Elsa, "Do you think it's true? That women can fly these planes?" Elsa rolled over, half asleep. "I think anything is true here. The world doesn't make sense anymore." But to Greta, it was finally starting to make sense. Maybe strength didn't mean shouting orders or carrying rifles. Maybe it meant doing what you were told you couldn't. Every day, the planes came and went. Every day, the same thrill burned inside her chest. She began sketching rough diagrams of aircraft parts she remembered from before the war. Wings, propellers, control levers. She wanted to understand them, not as distant miracles, but as machines built by hands like hers. The camp's routine no longer felt like a cage. It felt like a waiting room for something greater. One evening, a gust of wind carried laughter across the field. Greta stood at the fence, the setting sun bright behind her. On the other side, Nancy Corbett turned for a brief moment and smiled. It was then Greta decided. Somehow, she would meet her. The sky was calling, and she couldn't pretend not to hear it anymore. The chance came on a quiet afternoon, 2 weeks later. The sun was soft and the guards seemed half asleep. Greta had been assigned to carry tools from the storage shed to the fence line, where prisoners repaired broken crates. Beyond the wire, she could see the yellow training plane parked on the edge of the airfield, and near it stood the woman she had come to know by name, Nancy Corbett. Nancy wore her usual leather jacket, sleeves rolled up, hair tied in a simple knot. She was laughing with a mechanic, holding a clipboard and a pencil. Her confidence made everything around her seem lighter. Greta paused, watching, heart racing. This was the woman who had become the center of her thoughts, the one who proved that everything she'd been told back home was a lie. A guard shouted at her to hurry up. Greta obeyed, but her hands trembled as she worked. Later, when the day's tasks were done, she lingered by the fence longer than usual. The air was cooling, turning gold. Nancy was walking toward the small hangar, holding her flight gloves. She looked up, saw Greta standing there, and for a second hesitated. Then Nancy did something unexpected. She waved. Greta froze, looking around to see if anyone had noticed. A guard nearby was smoking, not paying attention. Greta lifted her hand slightly in return. That small gesture sent a rush of warmth through her chest. It was the first time in years that someone had seen her not as an enemy, not as a number, but simply as a person. The next day, Greta found a scrap of paper near the fence. It must have fallen from the hanger. It had pencil drawings of engine parts and English words she didn't fully understand. At the bottom was a quick sketch of an airplane wing and a short note, "For your collection." Greta gasped softly. The handwriting was neat, feminine. It had to be Nancy's. She hid the paper inside her uniform, heart pounding. That night she stared at it by candlelight, tracing the curves of the letters with her finger. For the first time in months, she smiled. Days later, she dared to leave something back. A small drawing she had made of the same yellow plane, folded neatly and tucked into the same spot by the fence. She didn't expect anything in return, but when she came back after morning roll call, there was a leather-bound logbook lying there. Old, scuffed, smelling faintly of oil and sun. Inside were pages filled with flight notes, numbers, and small messages. On the first page, Nancy had written, "Every pilot starts by watching the sky." Greta could hardly breathe. The book became her treasure. At night, she studied every line, every word. She didn't understand all of it, but she learned. Altitude, throttle, lift. The language of freedom. Elsa noticed her whispering these words in her sleep and shook her head. "Be careful," she warned. "Dreams can be dangerous here." Greta only smiled. So can fences. For weeks, their secret exchange continued. Small sketches, pages, bits of conversation across the wire when no one was near. Nancy spoke slowly, using gestures. Greta picked up new words. Engine, flight, sky. Sometimes Nancy would tap her chest and say, "Courage." Greta would nod, repeating softly, "Courage." But secrets don't stay hidden long in a place full of watchful eyes. One afternoon, a guard noticed Greta lingering too close to the fence. He barked an order, and she stepped back quickly, pretending to fix her shoe. That night, her hands shook as she tucked the logbook beneath her mattress. She didn't want to lose it, or the fragile friendship that had somehow crossed a war. Still, she knew one thing for certain now. Whatever came next, she would never again believe that the sky belonged only to men, and soon she would risk everything to touch that truth for herself. The chance came one windy afternoon. The guards had been called to help unload supplies, and for the first time in months, the airfield beyond the fence stood quiet. Greta's work group was cleaning tools near the edge of the compound. She could see Nancy's yellow AT-6 parked under the sun, its propeller still, gleaming like a piece of gold metal. Her heart began to pound. Every part of her body told her to stay put, but something stronger whispered, "Go." She looked around. Only one guard nearby, leaning against the post, half asleep in the heat. Elsa noticed the look on Greta's face and hissed, "Don't you dare." Greta whispered back, "Just for a moment." And then she slipped away. The world seemed to slow down as she ducked behind the sheds, crossed the empty strip of grass, and found a gap in the outer fence where the wire sagged. The air smelled of hot dust and machine oil. Her hands shook as she pressed through, scraping her sleeve on the barbs. A few steps later, she was standing beside the AT-6 Texan. The plane looked larger up close, its silver skin warm from the sun. The cockpit canopy was open. The smell of leather and gasoline hit her like a wave. For a long moment, she simply stared. At the control stick, the dials, the seat cushion shaped by someone's flight hours. "This is madness," she whispered to herself. But her feet moved anyway. She climbed onto the wing, her knees trembling, and then into the seat. Inside, everything was silent except for the wind outside. She ran her fingers over the switches and labels. They felt rough, used, alive. Her heart raced so fast it hurt. She remembered Nancy's words across the fence. "Every pilot starts by watching the sky." Now, for the first time, Greta was part of it. She closed her eyes and imagined the engine roaring, the ground falling away, clouds passing beneath her feet. She could almost feel the vibration in her bones. The joy was so sharp it scared her. Then, a shout. She opened her eyes. A guard stood by the hangar, staring at her in disbelief. "Hey, get down!" he yelled. Greta froze. 2 more guards ran toward her. She climbed out quickly, almost slipping, her heart hammering. Hands grabbed her arm, pulling her down. Dust filled her mouth as she hit the ground. "What do you think you're doing?" one of them barked. Before she could answer, Nancy appeared, running from the hangar. "Wait," she shouted. "It's all right. She's one of the POWs who helps with the tools. My fault. I left the cockpit open." The guards looked uncertain. Nancy's calm voice and confident stance made them hesitate. "No harm done," she added. She was just curious. After a tense moment, the guards let Greta go. One of them grumbled, "Keep her away from the planes next time." Nancy nodded. As they walked off, she turned to Greta and whispered, "Are you hurt?" Greta shook her head, still shaking. "I just wanted to see," she said softly. Nancy smiled faintly. "You saw. Remember it." Then she pressed something small into Greta's hand, a thin silver button from her flight jacket. "For luck." That night, Greta sat awake, holding the button between her fingers. Her hands still smelled faintly of fuel. Elsa scolded her for being reckless, but Greta only smiled through her tears. "I touched the sky," she said. The next morning she was moved to a different work detail, near the hangars, cleaning tools and sorting parts. Some said it was punishment. Greta knew better. Nancy had kept her promise. The dream wasn't over. It was only beginning. The new work detail felt like a quiet gift. Greta now spent her days near the hangars, where the air always smelled of grease, fuel and hot metal. She was not allowed near the cockpits anymore, but she could watch the planes up close. Every morning she wiped tools, sorted bolts, and cleaned engine covers under the watchful eyes of mechanics. At first, the men didn't talk to her. She was a German prisoner, after all. But when one of the American mechanics saw how carefully she handled a wrench, he raised an eyebrow. "You've done this before?" he asked. "A little," Greta said. "I fixed my father's motorcycle when I was younger." He gave a small nod. "Then make yourself useful." Soon, Greta was doing more than cleaning. She was checking spark plugs, carrying hoses, and even helping to test engines after repairs. The sound of an engine starting, that deep growl that filled the hangar, made her heart jump every time. The vibration ran through her hands, her chest, her whole body. One afternoon, Nancy walked in, wearing her leather jacket and goggles. She smiled when she saw Greta working beside the mechanics. "Not bad," she said. "You look like one of us?" Greta blushed. "I wish," she said quietly. Nancy leaned closer. "You're learning faster than some of the men," she whispered, smiling. "Don't stop." Those words stayed with Greta for days. Each week, she learned something new. How to read an altimeter, how to drain fuel lines, how to adjust a carburetor. She memorized the names of every tool and could tell which engine part belonged to which aircraft just by touch. Her hands grew rough and strong, her nails always black with oil. The guards sometimes mocked her. "What's the point?" one said. "You'll never fly." Greta didn't answer. She only smiled faintly and kept working. Deep inside, she knew something had changed. She no longer felt like a helpless prisoner. She felt capable. One day, while helping the crew test an engine, the mechanic asked her to pull the choke and turn the magneto switch. Greta hesitated, then did exactly as she had watched others do. The propeller spun, the engine coughed, and then roared to life. The mechanic shouted over the noise, "Good job, kid." For the first time in years, someone had praised her for something real. Later, Nancy came by again. "You've made friends here," she said. Greta nodded. "They're kind to me. Sometimes I forget I am not free." Nancy looked toward the open sky, where another plane climbed into the blue. "Freedom is not just about fences," she said softly. "It starts here." She tapped her temple. "In the mind." The words sank deep. Greta thought about them all night. That evening, she saw 2 wasps returning from a mission. Their faces were tired, their hair stuck to their foreheads with sweat, but they laughed as they walked. They were tired but proud, not because someone gave them permission, but because they earned it. Greta understood something then. Strength wasn't about shouting or controlling others. It was about doing what you loved, even when no one believed you could. By summer, Greta could tell when a plane's engine was tuned wrong just by listening. She even corrected one of the men once, carefully, respectfully. He tested her suggestion, and the problem was gone. From that day, they began to trust her more. It was a small victory, but in a world built on walls, even a small victory felt like flying. What Greta didn't know was that soon the war itself would end, and everything she had learned would face it. His greatest test. The war ended before anyone at Camp Segoville was ready. One morning, the guards gathered all the prisoners in the yard. The commandant read the news. Germany has surrendered. For a long moment, no one spoke. Some prisoners cheered quietly, thinking it meant they might go home. Others stared at the dirt, unsure what home even meant anymore. Greta felt something deep in her chest. Not joy, not sorrow, just a strange emptiness. That night, the camp was quieter than ever. No searchlights swept the fences. The air felt softer, like even the guards had stopped pretending to be enemies. Nancy came by one last time, her flight uniform covered in dust. "They're sending you home soon," she said gently. Greta nodded. "And you?" Nancy smiled faintly. "The war's over for us too. They say the Wasps are being disbanded. No more flights." Greta was shocked. "But you flew more than 20 missions. You helped win this war." Nancy shrugged. "Maybe. But they still see us as girls who borrowed men's wings." She looked toward the sunset. "Still, I'd do it again." When the day came, the buses lined up outside the gate. Greta hugged Nancy tightly. "Thank you," she whispered. "For what?" "For showing me the sky." Nancy pressed the silver button into Greta's palm again. "Don't forget," she said. "The sky belongs to anyone brave enough to reach for it." The journey home took weeks. When Greta finally stepped onto the dock at Hamburg, the city looked like a broken skeleton. Buildings were half gone, the air thick with smoke and dust. She walked through streets she no longer recognized, everything quiet except for the sound of hammers and people searching through rubble. Her family's house was gone. Her father had died in the last months of the war. Her mother now lived with relatives outside the city. Greta joined her, helping to grow potatoes and trade scraps for bread. Life was grey, cold, and silent. But every time she looked up, she thought of the Texas sky, bright, endless, full of planes. One day, while walking to the train station, she saw a small airfield outside Hamburg. A single-engine plane sat there, its wings patched with cloth. An old man was repairing it. Greta stopped to watch, her heart racing. The man noticed her and called out, "You like planes?" "Yes," she said quietly. "I used to help fix them in America, during the war." He laughed. "Then you're hired. I need hands." From that day, Greta worked in the hangar, cleaning spark plugs and patching holes with canvas. She earned almost nothing, but every time the plane's propeller turned, she felt alive again. In 1948, she saved enough money for her first flying lesson, a single hour in the air. The instructor laughed when she told him she had been a POW. "Then you already know how to survive," he said. The moment the plane lifted off, Greta felt tears in her eyes. The fields below looked small and soft. The clouds seemed close enough to touch. She thought of Nancy's words again. The sky belongs to anyone brave enough to reach for it. Years later, Greta became one of the few women in post-war Germany to earn a civilian pilot's license. She taught others to fly, too, including young girls who had never imagined it was possible. She never spoke much about her time in the camp, but she kept the silver button in her flight bag until the end of her life. To others, it was just a trinket. To her, it was proof that even behind barbed wire, a person could find freedom. Years passed, and the world changed. The war that had divided so many countries slowly became history, written in books, shown in newsreels, and told by those who had survived it. But for Greta, it never fully ended. Every time she smelled fuel or heard an engine start, she felt that same rush she'd known in Texas, the mix of fear, wonder, and hope. By the 1950s, women all over the world were stepping into new roles. Some became doctors, engineers, even pilots. The old rules were breaking, piece by piece. Yet the women Air Force service pilots, the WASPs, were mostly forgotten. Their service wasn't officially recognized, and their records were stored away, unseen. Greta often thought about Nancy and the other women she had seen walking across the hot runways in Texas. They had been laughed at, doubted, and dismissed. Yet they had flown more than 60 million miles during the war. They ferried more than 12,000 aircraft of 77 different types, from trainers to bombers. They faced danger without weapons or medals, and many had died in training accidents. But they proved that courage had no gender. In 1977, the US government finally honored the WASPs with military veteran status. Greta read about it in a German newspaper. She smiled, whispering, "It took them long enough." She was older now, with silver hair tied neatly under a scarf. She ran a small flight school outside Hamburg, teaching both men and women how to handle an aircraft's trembling controls and how to trust the wind. Her favorite lesson was always the first flight. When her students would climb into the cockpit, nervous and shaking, she would smile and say, "Don't worry, the sky doesn't care who you are, it only asks if you are brave." One afternoon, a reporter came to interview her for a local magazine. He asked, "You were a prisoner of war, and yet you chose to fly. Why?" Greta thought for a moment. "Because flying makes all borders disappear," she said softly. "When you are up there, you don't see barbed wire or flags. You only see clouds." He nodded, writing carefully, but she could tell he didn't fully understand. Few people did. In her small office, next to a black and white photo of a wasp smiling beside her plane, she kept the silver button, old, dull and worn smooth from years of being held. When students asked about it, she would only say, "A friend once gave this to me. She showed me the sky." Sometimes she dreamed she was back in Texas, standing at the fence, the air full of dust and the low hum of engines. She saw Nancy climbing into her plane, waving once before taking off. The sun would flash on the wings, and Greta would feel the same warmth she had felt that first day, the warmth of something bigger than fear. In the end, she realized something important. The war had been about power and conquest, about who ruled and who obeyed. But in that quiet airfield far from home, Greta had learned a different truth, that freedom was not given by any army or flag. It was discovered, person by person, in acts of courage and curiosity. The German women had come to America as captives. They left as witnesses, changed forever by what they had seen. They had once believed that women could never fly, but when they saw the wasps land their planes with steady hands and quiet pride, that belief died. And in its place grew something new, an understanding that no wall, no rule, no war could stop the human spirit from reaching upward. In the end, America's greatest weapon was not its bombs or tanks, but its freedom, and the belief that even behind fences, dreams could still take flight.